friends, this is Trish and welcome to Teacher Therapy. Back by popular demand, we have Gary. We actually did a video back in April talking about old school versus new school teaching. And it was all about how kids cannot read or regulate their emotions today. But one topic came up that caught a lot of people's attention. And Gary made a quote where he said, "You fix fatherlessness in this country, you fix most of the other problems." And that caught a lot of people by surprise. We got a lot of comments asking questions, and some people were even a little upset. So I thought, instead of trying to go back and forth in the comments, let's just bring Gary back and have him explain what he meant, and we can have a conversation about this. So I am going to go ahead and turn things over to Gary.
Hello. Well, I'm really glad to be back. I had a lot of fun the last time, and I just kind of wanted to start off, if it's okay, just talking about what this is not going to be about. Because there were some comments on our last video about, what if the man is really toxic and horrible and abusive? Okay. Let's just address that. Obviously, kids don't need to be around that kind of thing. All right. I'm not advocating for kids to be around men that are in that state of mind or having those kind of behaviors. So abuse is never something good. It should not be tolerated. So I'm not advocating for that. Although I will say that there are many men who have, either drug or alcohol addiction issues that, if we maybe got them some help, could end up being better partners and better fathers. I'm not saying all of them will, but there are quite a few that probably could. We need to extend to men the same thing that we extend to women, like compassion and empathy and all those things. And obviously, if the kid's in a really abusive situation, they need to be away from that. But anyway, I'm not advocating for kids or partners to stay in that situation. I'm also not going to try to address the whole thing around single mothers. I think single mothers have a tough road, a very, very tough, and single fathers do too, for that matter. It's always better when there's two parents together. In other words, I don't think we ought to praise them, and we should not condemn them either. I do think single parents, both mothers and fathers, should get some kind of help. And I don't mean just therapy. I mean, like, we need to have some policies, at least temporarily, in place that allow them to work and get childcare, like with maybe some kind of community effort where that's funded and so a safe place for their kids so that they can actually pursue their career and become more financially independent. And then it helps everybody. So I'm not one of these people that's like, oh, I don't want to help anybody. I do want to help. But the bottom line is that we have a lot more single mothers than we do single fathers. So just statistically, that's where we're going. Men are also often treated not equally in our judicial system, like in divorce proceedings. I mean, I have friends that have gotten divorced, and from all accounts, were much better fathers than their wives were mothers. And they were treated really polite. They had to fight tooth and nail to get visitation rights for their children. And that's something I don't think a lot of people are aware of. And I'm not going to get off into the weeds in that, but those are some things we should keep in mind. And the other thing is, because we're going to talk about trauma today, I'm not downplaying trauma. Okay, let me just say that in advance. I have a degree in psychology. My son has a degree in psychology. He's going into counseling, and he wants to treat people with trauma. We have lengthy conversations about the importance of mental health and addressing trauma. I'm not saying that, but I do think, I'm wondering if we're taking the wrong approach in some ways. And so I'm going to talk about some of those things, because I don't know if you know, I actually went back and started substituting, Trish.
Wow.
And it was eye-opening to me. I was at a third grade classroom recently. And you remember how we talked about self-regulation? These kids I couldn't teach them, Trish. They were out of control. They literally would fall out of their seats on a regular basis. And I mean, literally, just like, these are third graders. They would whine, they would complain, they would interrupt. I used to teach fifth grade, and if I had a really good lesson, I could go 15, 20 minutes, and boy, we would just be interacting and grooving. I couldn't go more than 5 minutes without them interrupting me. Like, I couldn't transmit the content at all. And I tried to I did a lot of prep stuff that the teacher didn't even ask me to do, because I knew that it wasn't very well structured. It wasn't a good lesson. And I tried to make it more engaging and interesting and understandable. And nothing that I did, with all my years of experience as a teacher or a consultant, worked. Like, these kids were complete. And I left just really dispirited. And I don't know how teachers do it, honestly. I think we're reaching a crisis point. And all of these things are playing into it. The trauma, the fatherlessness, all these things are components of it. And so we as a society have got to start addressing some of these issues. So
Absolutely.
that just sort of frames everything. The other thing is it's a complex issue, and I don't pretend to have all the answers. These are just my opinions. They're reasonable opinions, I think, and they're informed opinions. As somebody who's been in education, who has an understanding of psychology and cognition and all those kinds of things, I think some of the issues require collaboration. It's not a simple thing. I think people tend to just jump on ideological bandwagons. We only did it's just this. And I'm like, it's more complex than that. And again, I don't purport to have all the answers, but I do have some questions and concerns. And that's why, I agreed to come back, because I think we need a reasonable voice. We don't need to back ourselves into political corners and start screaming at each other. It's just enough of the polarization already. We're never going to solve problems in this polarized atmosphere. It'll never happen. And I just want to appeal to people to have calmer heads and to start listening to each other. You don't have to agree, but you need to listen. Maybe they just might say something. A congressman once said, a bird has two wings, it needs both wings to fly. And I think that's where we have one wing or the other, and we just flop around in circles. and so I'm hoping to be a voice of moderation and reason, and I'm not attacking anybody for anything. I'm just going where the data takes me, honestly.
Yeah, and I just want to add to what you're saying that fathers are important isn't in any way, shape, or form an attack on mothers, because it seems like people in this climate want to just rip somebody to shreds if you don't make 5,000 qualifiers. So we're acknowledging right now, moms are amazing. We love moms. Moms are great. But that does not take away from the importance of fathers. And we'll get into why that is so important.
So I really like this quote by T.I. He's a rapper that I wasn't even really familiar with him. Like, I'd heard his name before, but I didn't know anything about it. But then he said some things that I thought were intelligent. While there's currently great turmoil, there's even greater opportunity in the U.S. to work together. All right, there's the key, right? Work together to transform our community. Far too many of our children are fatherless. Far too many of our mothers are standing in the prison waiting rooms, and far too many of our young people feel hopeless. And he hit the trifecta on this one. I will tell you, as a father of a young man, and who talks with his friends, and really we have some pretty important conversations about life. This generation is not feeling real hopeful. Compared to how I felt when I was their age. I kind of felt like a king, honestly. I grew up in the 80s. I felt like a king all the time. I don't know. I just felt really good about it. I always felt pretty positive overall. I'm not saying I didn't get down, I didn't get depressed. I did. But overall, the zeitgeist from my generation, Generation X, we're large and in charge. That's how we kind of felt. We felt like in control of our lives for the most part. And I don't think they do. And all these things are sort of interconnected. Like the idea that these mothers are in prisons and waiting for their to see their husbands, to see them in prison. That's an issue. We can't just keep locking people up. All these things are things we need to start addressing. And I feel like the fatherlessness brings it all together. So here's some statistics for you. In 2019 census, nearly 16 million children, about 21%, are living with single mothers, compared to 8% in 1960. Now, that's almost a threefold increase. But what you have to understand is that's a threefold increase against a much larger overall population. In 1960, we had less than 180 million Americans. We now have 335 million Americans and counting, many of which do have kids. So a lot more kids, not just a percentage, but a lot more kids in general are being impacted. Now, there's a variety of reasons. Some of this is divorce. Some of this is just women choosing to have children without men. And some of this is due to alcoholism and drug abuse and fathers just not being stable enough to stay in the home. But all these things, regardless of what it is, kids are not having fathers in their lives, on one level or another. So obviously it's getting worse. It's not getting better. Now, there's so many factors that contribute to this, but there's things that we can do about each one of these things. But again, it's complex. But here are some things that I think we should talk about. So first is frequency of contact. Yeah, a father can be divorced, not living in the home, but if he has a lot of frequent contact with a child, they're probably going to be okay. If his contact is like once every couple of months or something, better than not at all, but it's not enough. A child needs that constant contact with that father figure. The age of the child matters. Often when they're younger, it tends to be worse for them because they don't have the coping mechanisms. And then they often internalize incorrectly that, my dad left because I did something wrong. And so there's a guilt component. The gender of the child matters in terms of how they react. Girls react a little bit differently than boys. And girls need their fathers just as much as boys need their fathers. Okay, we'll just say that. The economic contribution, if the father's at least able to give some money toward it and help out, that's obviously a helpful thing. One that we don't talk about very much, and this is especially true with divorced homes, is the quality of the father's relationship with the child's mother. If parents are really adversarial, and especially, and I will say this as a child of divorce, if they get dragged into the middle of it, it's tumultuous for kids. It's really painful, and they get torn trying to figure out who to be loyal to. That it actually happened to me. It's a difficult thing. And I was like 17, 18 years old when that happened. And I actually literally had to make a choice between my parents of like, I had to lock my mother out of the house because my father was in there and he had changed the locks and she wanted in and he didn't want me to let her in. Wow. And now I had to make a choice as a young man. And my choice was not to let my mother in because I didn't want the conflict, the danger of what could have ensued physically. I didn't, I was overwhelmed, and that just really kind of tore me up. And I don't think any child should have to experience that. And my parents didn't do that to me intentionally, right? Like I'd forgiven and I moved past that. But parents need to find a way to be amicable to each other, if at all possible, even when that other person is really, really difficult, because if not, the kid suffers. So that's a factor we should always take into account. There's socioeconomic variables. In fact, honestly, you could boil almost all of this down, especially with single mothers, to socioeconomics. It's a poverty thing. And so we need to come together to figure out solutions, elevate and support single parents so that they can get out of that trap. Education, which is also, of course, linked to socioeconomic. Of course, the quality of the father's relationship with the child. How do they relate? Do they just kind of like do drive-by parenting? And by the way, drive-by parenting is better than no parenting at all. Just having that person at all in your life. But are they having quality moments with that kid? Are they bonding with them on an emotional level? Are they giving them support? Are they connecting with them? Are they having conversations that are important? Are they teaching them things that are important? All those are really crucial. And then we can get into parenting style, and I'm not going to get all into, I think that's like a whole nother video, but those things like really matter. When those things are done in a more productive, positive way, it can kind of attenuate for some of the gap that's there with the father not being in the home, if that makes sense. Also, there's compensatory dynamics. So if a child doesn't have a father, but they have like an alternative figure, a surrogate, a father figure, including a stepfather, that can be really helpful. I'm not saying it replaces a dad because it doesn't, although in some cases it does. There are people who I've talked to who stepfather kind of rescued them, but it doesn't have to be a stepfather. It can sometimes be an older sibling or an uncle. And it doesn't even have to be a family member. It can be somebody in the community. It could be a pastor. It could be somebody, a teacher. Other people, we need to recognize when kids are fatherless and step in with role models for them. It's not really replacing the father, but it does help kind of fill in a little bit. Family history has a lot to do with it. There's things like related to mental illness and so forth that we have to take into account. And those things need to be addressed. The length of time that the father's been away from the child's home, the longer, the worse, right? The less frequent the visits, the worse. And then siblings can be compensatory, depending. If the siblings are all kind of headed down the wrong path, then sometimes they drag the younger ones with it. I know you saw that probably as a teacher, or about that. But often an older brother can be helpful, and it's not even just older brothers, older sisters. Those are like sort of emotional pieces that can fill in relationships that can kind of compensate for not having a father. So those are all things I think that are good things. We have some tools in our tool chest if we want to use them. The research on fatherlessness is just like, it's pretty robust. Like the consequences of kids not having a father in the home. And I'm not just talking about divorce. I'm also talking about kids who just really don't have a father. I mean, I will tell you, one of my jobs, before I retired, I was a literacy language arts consultant. One of my jobs was to work with kids in a prison school. I mean, and it was a school, actually, let me reframe that. It was a school within a juvenile prison. You were locked in with them. When those doors locked, there were officers there. It was a really grim, the most sad situation. I would come home and I would feel so depressed. And sometimes I taught lessons to these kids. Sometimes I helped other teachers teach lessons. What I primarily tried to do was have conversations with kids, which sometimes it didn't go anywhere because they were too defensive. But there were kids who would open up to me. And here's what they would tell me. over and over and over again. I don't have a father. I've never had or they would say, F my dad. You know what I mean? Because he did this and this to me. But it was kid after kid after kid after kid. I mean, I don't know how much more evidence we need. Go work in some of those environments and talk to those kids about not having a father. It hurts them. Like it emotionally wounds them. It traumatizes them. So when kids don't have fathers, they develop externalizing behaviors. In boys, it's often acting out. In girls, it's with promiscuity and relationship issues. But they may drop out of school. They may do drugs, all kinds of things that get them in trouble and end up putting them on a path that's going to end up in a juvenile detention center if they're not careful. The thing is, the damage persists throughout life. Like, it may be from childhood, but they carry it with them. That's the true trauma, right? Like, that's something that is internal, and it persists throughout their life until they get some help. Some of those compensatory things we were talking about, a father figure, some type of intervention, but those things carry forward and they don't just go away over time. They often get worse. So kids that don't have fathers are at risk for eating disorders, depression, suicide, poverty. So, we talk about generational poverty. One of those generational poverty markers is not having a father in the home. You're more likely to become poor yourself. 2 times greater risk of infant mortality without a father, more likely to go to prison, more likely to commit crimes. This is not just something I just make. I mean, I gave you my resources on this. This is pretty thoroughly documented. So it's not just like, oh, well, they don't need a father. There's other things that are more important. There's all sorts of factors that are important, but this is a crucial one. You can't just take a father out and then say, oh, everything's just going to be hunky-dory. It doesn't work like that. There's consequences, and these are some of them. And I don't know, maybe, I'm not sure what your experience was as a teacher. You probably talked to teachers who, I'm sure, that talk about kids that don't have fathers. I don't know. Can you talk about that at all? Or
I feel like that was a very taboo subject when I worked in Title I or urban schools. It's the thing that you weren't really allowed to say. But I just remember my first few years as a teacher and just realizing almost none of the kids had the same last name as their parents. And I was initially really confused and shocked. And then it clicked like, oh, like almost 80% plus of these kids don't have a relationship with their biological father, or their parents are split up, or maybe boyfriends are living in the house and circulating through. So it was one of those things that I found in public education. You're not allowed to say, you're not allowed to comment on anything. You're not allowed to suggest, that there might be issues with the value system in homes. And so it was one of those things I think that we all thought about, but we couldn't talk about. And that's why I'm so glad we're able to have this conversation today.
That is both telling and incredibly disturbing that we're not allowed to talk about something that is so obviously important and consequential. You would think, with all the trauma-informed dialogue that's going on right now, right? That would be something we would be talking about. Why would we refuse to talk about? That's like the proverbial elephant in the room, is it not? Like, we're just not going to talk about this fact that these kids, oh no, it's another factor. There's other factors. Of course there's other factors. There's always other factors. But don't ignore this factor either, right?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to the fact that everything is equated with making moral judgments. So to begin to talk about the fact that fatherlessness is a problem, you'd have to acknowledge the fact that maybe there's problems with some of the predominant sexual ethics in our culture. You would have to start questioning what kind of values are being promulgated on movies and, music and television and popular culture. There's so many factors that are linked towards somebody's values and ethics. If you even begin to say that this is a problem, you're saying that people's behaviors are a problem. And in our culture and society, that is highly frowned upon. We're supposed to champion the idea of all choices are great. Choices don't have consequences. And it's just a really bizarre landscape in education, because we're starting to see the consequences of all of these broken families. And just for fun, I looked up some statistics too. And so, for example, children from single parent families are twice as likely to suffer from mental health. Children living absent their biological father are 2 to 3 times more likely to be expelled. This was interesting. It said there was a study done that said girls who feel close to their father are 75% less likely to have a teen birth. And it just goes on and on and on about all of these different statistics that this situation with not having fathers is such a big problem. And as you mentioned, same with the prison statistics, 70% of people that are in juvenile detention centers come from fatherless homes. And we also see too, when children have an actively involved father, they're 33% less likely to drop out of school and 43% more likely to get A's. So it would seem that schools would have some kind of interest in this. And it's just kind of bizarre. And I guess it's probably outside of the scope of this video, but some of the values that are slowly, getting into schools are the exact opposite of what one would call family values, maybe traditional values. And so it's just a disaster because we're just seeing society fall apart, but we have to pretend that people's decisions don't have anything to do with the results that are happening.
Yeah. I mean, and I appreciate everything that you're saying. And honestly, I just keep coming back to the same thing. The statistics are the statistics are the statistics. You can say whatever you want, and we won't even get into value judgments or anything. And I'm not even making value judgments. I'm simply saying we have all of these problems, and they're all established and linked to fatherlessness. So why, if we can't have a conversation about that, about something so incredibly fundamental, I don't know how we solve anything in our society. Now, do I think we should do it in a non-condemning manner? Yeah, I do. I mean, I think people need help, but we have to have the conversation. We have to start talking about these things. If what I'm seeing in those classrooms is any indication, we're really in big trouble. Why can't we talk about something that is so basic and fundamental?
I think too, it's kind of interesting because that also gets into the conversation of, do men have a specific value to society that's a little bit different than what women bring? And I feel like that's such a taboo conversation because traditionally men were thought of as protectors, providers, ones that provide structure and discipline and order to a home. And so the idea that we're erasing all of that now means, well, why shouldn't it be okay to erase that, to not have a father in the home? And so I just think that this goes so much back to cultural values and the conversations that people are having, even on gender. And are there differences between men and women? And I think because of all of those landmines and taboo things, this all plays into this larger issue of men missing from homes and their families. I think some maybe don't feel valued. They don't feel like they have a role, or they don't feel like the qualities that they bring are treasured anymore. So I just think it's a huge mess.
No, I think you're right. I think it's really a tough road for young people now. And I think it's particularly tough for young men who are actually, if you just look at the data, more at risk even than young women. Women are crushing it right now compared to young men. They're graduating from college more. They're going on to succeed more. Young men are flailing. They're more depressed. They're more anxious. And by the way, let me say it with a caveat. There's plenty of women who are struggling too, okay? The milieu in which we live is one of sort of like roiling anxiety. And that's what they've passed on to these kids. Like, it's horrible in my opinion. I don't think they're serving kids well to make them feel that way. But I will tell you, as a father of a young man, and also I've counseled with a lot of his friends, these young men are lost. They are absolutely, I mean, not so much my son, but some of his friends that he's brought over, I'm just like, wow, no direction. And almost all of them have no fathers, by the way, okay? They're lost. They don't know what they're about. They can't control their behaviors. They do things that end up costing them their jobs all the time. So they hop from job to job. They abuse drugs to the level that it's interfering with their life. They have really tumultuous relationships filled with drama, like unnecessary drama. They make bad decisions. There's just a host of things that go with that. And almost all of them don't have a father. My son's friends that have fathers, guess what? Most of them are pretty stable and doing pretty well, but a lot of them are really struggling. And I think we need to start talking about those things. And men do bring something valuable to the relationship. And it's not just, the traditional things, the structure and the discipline and all that kind of stuff. Those are all important. Fathers also just bring affection and love. A father can be affectionate, a father can be loving, can be compassionate, and can teach both strength and empathy, right? Because those two things go together. If you're just overly empathic to the point that you're just being weighed down constantly with guilt about everybody else's situation, and you're not taking care of yourself, and you can't act from a point of confidence and strength yourself, that comes from largely from the father. And we can't just like, oh, we're just going to toss that out. Okay. These things are, I think, genetically embedded to some degree. They're also social. Yeah, I get it, but regardless of whether they're social or genetic or biological, obviously kids need them because they're not doing very well without them. I don't really know how else to say it. Fathers bring something to the table that's important. And it's not just for sons, like from this slide that we have here, daughters are really vulnerable too. So one thing in psychology that we know is boys tend to model the women that they want in general based on their mother's attributes. Like they kind of look for somebody like their mother, not fully, and some of it's unconscious. And I guess Freud was just a little bit right about this. And then girls tend to look for guys that are similar to their father. So if a father is degrading and abusive, then that daughter is likely going to go look for a man that's degrading and abusive. But if a father says, look, this is how a man should treat you. He should treat you with kindness and sympathy and honesty and integrity. Then they're going to look for guys. They're going to have the boundaries set to look for guys that have those deeper characteristics, not just money, not just looks. They're going to look deeper into a man's heart. And the same thing for a son. Like they're going to learn to look for what is important in a woman. All right. Creativity is another thing that comes from fathers. Yes, I'm sure it comes from mothers too, but I'm just citing with the information that I looked up. Okay. A sense of authority. Like if you have anxiety disorders, part of that is you just don't really have a lot of confidence and sense of who you are. Well, daughters get a lot of that from their fathers. Self-esteem. These are all things that fathers can bring to their kids and help them out with. So it's just like the quote here says, father involvement was the only factor in this research that decreased the odds of engaging in sexual activity, and none of the other family's process was found to be statistically significant. Was the dad in the home and being a dad, right? Not just a father, but being a dad. Well, that cut down on promiscuity. And I'm not making a value judgment about promiscuity, like, oh, she's bad because she's promiscuous. Boys should not be promiscuous either, honestly. We should kind of watch and manage ourselves and who we're involved with. But promiscuity, especially for a girl, comes with all kinds of repercussions. You end up with unplanned pregnancies, and then you have to make a decision based on that. And so there's all kinds of things that go, sexually transmitted diseases. Also, engaging in a lot of these relationships are really negative relationships. They're abusive. Well, fathers can help attenuate those things. And we can't just say they're not necessary because the proof is in the pudding and the statistics don't lie. So we can say whatever we want about, just really don't need men and they're not all that important and they're just dogs or whatever you want to say. The statistics don't back it up. I'll just keep coming back to that. What does the data say? What does the data say? What does the data say? And I'm not going to back down from that because it's overwhelmingly painting a very bad picture of what's going on here. None of it's good. Okay? There's nothing positive associated with fatherlessness. It's not like a double-edged sword. Oh, you get some good things and you get some bad. No, it's all bad. Unless we go back, Trish, to what I said in the beginning. Yes, the father is abusive. Of course, then, but even then, Trish, it's not like it doesn't impact them some way not having that father. We'd be better off helping that father address whatever emotional needs and psychological needs so that he can be back in the home. Some of those are probably not possible. There's probably some that just need to go away. I get it. But I just think we need to value everybody, and everybody includes men and especially fathers. That's all I'm saying. And if that is controversial in your mind, then we have completely gotten off track in our society. There is no way on earth that should be controversial. I don't even begin to understand the mentality that says that's controversial. So if they want to put some comments and say I'm controversial, okay, but I don't know how you do that.
Oh, agreed. And yeah, it was interesting. I'm just looking at this statistic. One study showed that girls whose father left home before they were 5 were 8 times more likely to become pregnant as adolescents. And one thing that when I was doing some research, I found really interesting is the generational and cyclical nature of fatherlessness. So it's really sad, I think, especially for sons, because if they grew up with a dad, then it becomes normal to them to possibly impregnate 5 women and not be a father in any of their lives. And I think that that's tragic as well. And that's a kind of a place where since we're being controversial, it's really sad, but in the Black community, something like 70% of children are fatherless. And I would point back to, I think, again, popular culture and what are the role models being set up for men. If they're rappers that are glamorizing the degradation of women, that are glamorizing, quote unquote, baby mama culture, if they're glamorizing drugs and alcohol and gang activity, and that's seen as the father figure role because there's not an actual father in the home, then that becomes cyclical. And then women get put in an awkward position because they feel like, oh, if I try to be like chaste and pure traditional woman, I'm never going to get a boyfriend and I'm going to be alone, because men are expecting certain activities, clearly from the statistics, from a very, very young age. And a lot of that behavior was seen in school and was super shocking to me as a teacher, just the kind of knowledge that elementary school students had of, very, very adult themes. And it's just this awful cycle that goes over and over and over again. And I think at some point, until we can start talking about these things, we can't begin to hope to even change it.
I think you're onto something with that, Trish. I mean, honestly, there's a psychological principle known as priming. So it's basically the things that we hear and say and experience all the time. We tend to look for those things down the road to confirm them, right? So if we're constantly hearing all these negative imagery and suggestions through popular media, we're going to be primed cognitively to look for those things and to seek them out. It doesn't mean that kids aren't going to listen to rap or whatever, or to rock and roll. I mean, I remember as a kid, like, that rock and roll is devil's music, but I think in comparison to some of the stuff now, it's like really like there's always gradations, right? There's always degrees of something. And I think it's gone off the tracks with how intense some of these images and suggestions and lyrics, and it's over the top. One thing that just tells me we've gone off the track is what we're talking about right now. I believe President Obama actually spoke about at one point. He actually talked about homes without fathers. And nobody got upset about it. They're like, yeah, he's right. And he was right. And it was like such a poignant, beautiful speech. And now that's controversial. And I'm like, he wasn't president that long ago. You know what I'm saying? Like, where have we gone where that was applauded and now you say it and it's controversial? How?
And I think in the last 3 years, it's like something has radically changed. And it's been, I think, slowly happening over time, but it's just incredible in the worst way possible how rapidly public perception of once long-held basic truths has just fallen apart in a few years.
And you touched on something that I think is really important, because you talked about how girls start engaging in behaviors that then kind of reinforce the whole thing, right? I think the way that we're sort of built, men sort of live up or down to women's expectations. Okay, controversial. Controversial. I know that's really controversial. No, I mean, if women expect men to sort of behave themselves and behave in a certain way, right? Have a certain amount of integrity, they will. But if they don't expect them to, and in fact, they almost promote the opposite of it, that's what they're going to get. Because men will gladly drag their knuckles through the mud, won't they? It just men kind of live up and down or down to women. Women have always been sort of the moral standard bearer. So if they're not going to be our partners in doing that, and you know how it is. It's like the guy's like going out and drinking every weekend and just raising hell, and then they get married and they suddenly become like a civilized, responsible person. Mm-hmm. That's because they're living up to a higher set of expectations. They can't do those behaviors anymore, at least not all the time. And I think, it's okay to let loose and whatever. But I just think men sort of live up or down to the expectations that women put out there. And in fact, men are particularly at risk. They're at risk for dropping out of work during their prime working years. Right now, young males, especially young white males, are at record rate of not working. They have been completely detached from the workforce. Overdosing, drinking, suicide, dying earlier of things like heart disease and all these things that are part of that's diet, but part of it is stress and a lack of connectedness, because we're social beings and we need that connection. Higher levels of loneliness. And those are all related to like chronic diseases like dementia, and early mortality through the cardiovascular risk actually get increased. Loneliness is not just a social disease. It manifests itself physiologically. Like through our stress system. So here's a quote for you. Since 1950, the death rate of young females ages 10 to 24 has gone down by 30%. But for males in this age, it's only gone down by 15%. And almost every data that's out there right now, men are doing worse. And these men are potentially fathers. Either are fathers or they're potentially going to be fathers, and they're not in good shape, right? And I'm not trying to do the violent, oh, poor, pitiful me. I'm just casting a light on the fact that, if we're going to have empathy, that empathy has to go broadly. It can't just be for some group of people. And we can't just say, oh, they're this type or they're men or whatever, and we're just going to ignore them.
Yeah, I think it turns out that people are discovering the hedonistic lifestyle that is being billed as liberation is actually miserable and depressing. And surprise, surprise, statistically, men that are married with children are happier and healthier. And so this disaster that's happening in our culture is hurting men and women. And, like you said, I think that in the older generations, it was scoffed at so much when women were encouraged to be chaste, and to save themselves from marriage and what's considered antiquated traditional values. But I think society and culture was so much more stable when marriage was a value, when you weren't having tons of teen pregnancies, when that behavior was discouraged as a society, as a community, by parents and families. And there was so much support and reinforcement for the things that have made sense for thousands of years, which is stable marriage and family in a unit, and men not cheating on their wives, and women not engaging in scandalous, crazy behaviors. And it sounds so shocking and old-fashioned to say these things, but I think, like you're saying, it's bad for men too. Men are no happier, being on video games all the time. Men are no happier living, the single bachelor life and, Tinder and all the little, dating apps and things. Like, that's not a happy way to live. It turns out that marriage and family and home and commitment and all of these so-called traditional values, that's where the happiness is.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So two things happened. Pretty short order after each other. The first was birth control. The pill came out. And then shortly after that, the counterculture revolution of the 60s happened. And so what happened is you decoupled sexual activity from marriage and children. And of course, we're human beings, so we've always done it outside of marriage. I'm not being naive about it. But there was always this idea that, okay, yes, but eventually it's going to lead to this path of a stable relationship, marriage, and children, in that order, right? Because that's the best order. If there's going to be an order, that's the best order. It got decoupled. And then you add to the next dynamic is that because actually women are doing much better and they're rising in the ranks of, companies, they're doing better in the workforce, they're graduating more from high school, more from college than men are. There's more women going to medical school, I believe now, than men are. Because of that, they've also divorced themselves from men in general because they don't need them. They're financially independent. And what happens, not all, and I'm all for that. That's all great. I mean, I think women should be afforded the same opportunities that men have, right? But often what happens is they reach a certain age and they're killing it, right? They're killing it in their career. They're just crushing it. They're getting promoted up the ladder. They're making a lot of money. They're getting a lot of recognition. Their achievement is through the roof. But then they reach a certain age and they're looking around for men, for a partner and for marriage and children. And it's hard to find them. It's been so narrowed down that most of those men are already gone. The other factor, and this is what's really sad for young men now, is online dating. The whole idea of online dating was that it was going to open up this huge ocean or this huge venue where we can all get connected, right? We're all seeking each other. Well, it hasn't worked that way for the vast majority of men. The top 10% of men get 90% of the play on social media. So you have a few at the top, and by top I mean either looks, income, or a combination of the two. If you're really good looking, you make a lot of money, those are the men that want the women, right? All the others, swipe. You're gone. I don't need you. So that's one of the things that leads to all the loneliness, because those men are no longer. I have all these dating apps, but I can't even connect with these women because they want these other ones. The problem is that those top 10% don't necessarily want marriage or relationships. They're often out just for a sexual good time. And so now all these men are just, they're taking advantage of that. And that's all these women can connect to because that's the group that's there. So what you have is one small percentage of group exploiting the whole thing and a bunch of other men sort of left in the dust that actually might have a lot more integrity if women would maybe look beyond some of these factors like, and I'm not saying like, go date a really ugly guy or a guy that's like indigent. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that guys are more complex than that. And then you maybe need to get to know some people a little bit. Often if you date somebody for a little bit, you'll notice they become more attractive because you discover them as a person. There's a value system in there like, this is a full human being. And they bring a lot more to the table than just whatever it is online, their looks or their paycheck. In fact, I was watching a video the other day and there were some women describing what they wanted in men. Okay, they wanted a guy that was over 6 feet tall, 6'2" if possible. And they wanted a guy that made 150 and beyond.
Wow.
Do you know what percentage of men fit in that?
1%.
Not even 1%. Less than 0.5%.
Wow. That's wild.
And it's kind of like, as a guy, like, how do I'm earning $45,000, $50,000 a year or whatever, but I'm a good guy. I have integrity and I treat people well and I'm loving and compassionate. I'm empathetic. I'm responsible. I would be really good with kids. Nope.
That's so interesting because it almost feels like men are in the position that women have actually felt like they were in since the dawn of time. Because it's kind of fascinating. Women have always complained like, men want a Victoria's Secret supermodel. They don't want an average looking woman. But maybe since things have moved online, the only thing that you see initially about a person is their looks. And so that, exacerbates our human desire to be shallow. But that's so interesting because I've actually heard a lot of women with the same complaint, feeling like men have very, very unrealistic, expectations of what a woman should look like. And so they feel like they're getting passed over. Whereas
that's that top 10% though, that I'm talking about.
It's interesting.
I don't know for sure, but I'm thinking that's part of it. Who are they looking at? And some of this, kind of what you're getting at, Trish, is some of this maybe just be payback. I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, like, okay, we know the history and yeah, maybe it is payback. My point, though, is that payback's not the way to go.
Right.
Like that's not going to help anybody. Like, do we want to rectify the sins of the past? Of course we do. Do we want to equalize things and we want to make things better? But we don't want to like institute the same dynamic, but on the other side. Why? Why would we want to do that? That's not going to help anybody. It's not going to help men. And if it's not helping men, how is it going to help women? Because women ostensibly want a relationship with these men. So I don't know how like turning the tables is going to get us anywhere down the road. I understand the desire in some, and that gets into like the whole Me Too movement. I get it. You turn the tables, but just be careful. Because it's almost like the Hammurabi thing, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, which leaves us all blind and unable to chew on the truth, right? Because we don't have any teeth. We can't just take revenge. And also, you're taking revenge on the wrong guys. These aren't the dudes from the 1940s and the 50s, are they? They're your peers right now. They have nothing to do with that. They don't bear any responsibility for that. Now, if they behave that way, yes, they do. But see, all these dynamics are just playing into each other. And my thing is that we all need each other. We need each other as family members. We need each other as friends. We need each other as societal counterparts, and we need each other as men and women. And if that's controversial, I don't know how to get past that. But we need each other, and if we need each other, which we obviously do, we can't demonize each other. We have to be able to come together in some way. And I don't think we're doing that. And to go back to what you said, some of that is a value system. Some of that's
I think values are everything.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I don't want to get off into the weeds and all that, but obviously that value system goes back to this priming. Your value system primes you for what to look for, right? So if your value system says, as a woman, I'm going to look for a guy that is caring and empathetic and responsible, then that's what I'm going to look for. If my value system says I'm looking for a guy that is a gangster, thug, a pig, when I call it whatever you want, you know, a dude that's just reprehensible, and there's plenty of guys that are like that, then that's what you're going to look for, and that's exactly what you're going to get. But those guys don't care about you anyway, right? So,
and I guess that ties into our bigger conversation is fatherlessness, because like you said, for women especially, if they've never had a man treat them with dignity and honor, and they turn on, you know, music videos and see Cardi B and how she's dressed and behaving and thinking, oh, that's what guys want, then they feel the pressure to reenact what they believe that men want, but then they get treated poorly and broken up with. Or, you know, I have a few friends that are single mothers, but not because they didn't have the original romantic idea. I'm thinking of one who did everything right. She got married, she had 3 children, but then the guy left her for another woman and just totally bailed on the kids. And this happens, you know, it seems to not even matter if they're like conservative church communities, because that's the community that I'm a part of. But I'm thinking of a former pastor's wife that literally did everything right. She married a pastor, you know, afterward had her children, and he had the affair and cheated on her and left her with the kids. She only had a high school education, so she had to struggle to just clean houses to be able to put food on the table. And so I'm sure that's a separate video in and of itself, but I think our cultural values of, you know, staying married is something else that has really struggled, because I think one issue is people that are not marrying at all and having lots of kids out of wedlock. But then a whole nother issue is people that are getting married and having children, they get a divorce, and then the women are often left with the children, and then they don't see the dad again. So it seems to all be coming back to this, you know, this lack of a value for marriage, family, commitment, faithfulness, you know, getting rid of infidelity and all of those things. And I guess my last controversial point of the day would be that a lot of those values came from a Judeo-Christian worldview. I think as people stop believing in God, you know, they have no mental reason to have any of those values, any of those traditional beliefs, you know, the idea that, you know, you shouldn't commit adultery, for example. And I wouldn't say that that's only obviously a Judeo-Christian value, because there's been those values throughout different cultures and civilizations. But I think in America specifically, we're leading the charge for broken families, fatherlessness, teen pregnancy, et cetera, et cetera. And I think by looking at what's going on with culture, we see in many ways a disdain for those values. And I'm just thinking out loud and wondering if a lot of that goes back to, at some point, maybe it was in the 60s, a break with, you know, a belief in God where some of those values came from.
Yeah. And I mean, like, again, there's almost like a payback kind of thing, because even within those value systems and like within those churches, like your friend there, people were not behaving the way that they were speaking, right? Like, oh, I'm going to tell you this and I'm going to quote this Bible verse, but then behind the back, look what I'm doing. And I think that turned a lot of young people off, and rightfully so, you know, because I think the one thing that young people cannot stand is hypocrisy, right? And I get it. Like but that doesn't mean that everybody in those situations behaves like that either. And I think you know, it's an important point. Okay, so we've moved more toward agnosticism. You know, a lot of young people are agnostic. My son is agnostic, you know, and he wasn't raised to be agnostic, but he's agnostic. He's not atheist, and he's not like belligerent about it. And he actually has a belief that there's something beyond. He just doesn't know what it is. But there's a lot of agnosticism among young people. So what happens is you build this void, right? Okay, nature abhors a vacuum. What are you filling it with? So we got rid of this one set of standards because you saw it as fraudulent and hypocritical. Fine, I get it. What did you replace it with? You know what we replaced it with, right? We replaced it with pop culture, and we replaced it with social media and all the stuff that comes with that. Well, if you thought like religious values were bad, and you thought there was like hypocrisy and issues and problems within that domain, let's just look at the other one. Because you have to have something beyond yourself that's deeper than just your carnal instincts, right? There has to be something guiding us in some sort of moral direction. And it's certainly not pop culture. That's for sure. That's hedonistic at the best, right? So we're in this place in society where we've upended religion and said we don't like all of the hypocrisy and inconsistencies in it, but we certainly haven't replaced it with anything better. In fact, I think we've done worse in a lot of ways, because those don't give you any kind of moral guidance that's stable and unchanging. And so I think people are struggling with that. You remember, that old saying by Friedrich Nietzsche, and he said, "God is dead," right? What people don't realize is that Nietzsche was not necessarily applauding that. He was actually firing a warning shot, saying, okay, we've reached that point, but now what? Because now there's a vacuum. And if we don't replace it with something that is equally substantial and helpful, what are we going to do? We're just inventing it off of ourselves. It's not based on any kind of passed down wisdom, which those things did have wisdom. They did, and they do. We're just going to like jettison them and sort of float around in this miasma of pop culture and do whatever you want to do. That doesn't work either. And it doesn't make people happy, and it doesn't make them feel secure, and it doesn't make them feel connected. What it does is it just leaves them over time. Once you get past all the fun stuff when you're really young, it just leaves you sort of hollow. And I think that's where we are, and makes you anxious and depressed. That's just my opinion about it.
I agree.
So anyway, we've had these things, and we have not fully integrated these dynamics into our consciousness and ways of being. We're still working through all the things I just told you about. We're still working through the fact that we have birth control. We're still working through the fact that there was a counterculture. We have not figured out how to put all the pieces back together after we blew them all up. And this is a price that we're paying for it. I'm hoping that we're going to do it. What I want to say is that fathers need to be a part of it and men need to be a part of it. And to your point that some of these men are behaving so reprehensibly, that's on them. That's not women's fault. That's on them. But what is going on in society that tells men that that's okay to do? What are we doing? You know what I'm saying? Like, what kind of thing, what kind of ship are we designing that's telling men that's okay to do? Because it's not okay to do, because you have children and a wife, and you don't do those kind of things, right? That's not how you behave yourself.
I've heard people say that they think Gen Z might actually change to the opposite tide because they're seeing so much of this misery and brokenness, and they're starting to say like, maybe there was something to some of those traditional values. So it'll be interesting to see, what happens with Gen Z and Gen Alpha, as they're just watching everything fall apart, if they don't, find out just by sheer virtue of seeing in front of them that this way isn't working.
Yeah. I mean, you always hope that a generation can turn things around, right? And I think part of the problem is that there's so much coming at these kids. They're just drowning in information and ideas, and not in a healthy way. I feel like they're overwhelmed with it all. And I think we are too. But when you're younger, you have less coping mechanisms and you have less wisdom to filter those things through. So it's even harder to just get a grasp on what reality even is anymore. Like, what is that? What does that even mean? We've sort of like distorted that whole thing. So I think this generation has a huge task or burden ahead of them. They're smart. I think they can do it. But one of the things, and it's kind of like, I don't think we talk about this, is we've lost intergenerational contact, right? We used to learn from elders, and we used to revere wisdom that only comes through going through life and basically getting the crap beat out of yourself. That's how you learn. You go through the grinder, so to speak, and you develop a set of values and ideas and a wisdom that goes with it. There's a disconnection between the elderly and children. Like those generations, and part of that, Trish, is because we prize youth above all in our culture. And youth is great. You never feel better than when you're young, usually. But how we're not having intergenerational contact, and therefore we're losing that wisdom. And what we said is like, everyone from that, they're just like patriarchal pigs, and they're got old-fashioned values, and they're religious, and they're just horrible people, and they hate everybody, and like, that's oversimplifying it. I think that's just not true. Yeah, some of them do say those kinds of things, but even if they do, that doesn't mean that everything that they say has no value at all. Like, people learn some things by going through life, and we have completely discounted that mechanism that connects generations. So we need to have more intergenerational conversations. And older people, I'll put myself in that category, need to open up and listen to younger people without judgment. But younger people need to just stop with the defensiveness. Please stop with the moral outrage and indignation. Just listen, put it aside. Not everything has to be controversial and horrible and outrageous. And, I'm so morally outraged. Everybody's morally outraged. we can't even listen to each other. So please, can we just do that? That's just my plea in general.
I totally agree. And that kind of reminds me too, with this generation, I think it can be a pro and a con. They're much more trauma conscious, than previous generations. So the good part of that is that they are more able to identify their feelings and see possible situations where there's something unfair happening. But as we talked about in the last video, sometimes there can be an over-identification with trauma, or people saying that they're traumatized over absolutely nothing. So I know you have a lot of thoughts on that.
It's a sticky wicket, as they say, because trauma is ultimately not the event. It's how you process it. I mean, that's just like a psychological principle. So I don't ever want to discount trauma. But there's some things to keep in mind, So just according to some of the research that I did, less than 10% of people who go through trauma are likely to have to develop PTSD. So we've overused the word PTSD. I got PTSD. I got PTSD. I got PTSD. And maybe you do, but true PTSD is probably a little more rare than people would begin to realize. Like, not everything that just because you view it as trauma has to become embedded in your DNA, and then you have to live out your life in this trauma-informed way, right? What does it mean to be trauma-informed? Does it mean like, oh, I'm going to respond with empathy to kids who actually have some issues? Or does it mean I, as an individual, am going to look for opportunities to reinforce the idea that I'm traumatized and everything will traumatize me in the process? You remember we talked about priming before? So if you prime kids about trauma, they're going to look for trauma in everything. Why is this generation so much more anxious? Because we've developed an entire milieu or web of anxiety for them to bask in. And then we've told them, yeah, this is all trauma. We have to kind of have some kind of happy medium in the middle where we acknowledge when we have true trauma going on, because I think we swept it under the rug in the past. But at the same time, not teaching kids to always look for trauma, not teaching them to reframe things as experiences instead of trauma. It's all about how you frame things and experience them, right? And how you view them. Your reality is how you view things. So if I'm going to view everything that I go through as trauma, then it will be trauma. And I'll just keep reinforcing it. And again, I'm not saying kids don't have trauma. They do. And I like the second bullet. The most alluring aspect of the trauma trap argues that feeling unseen or unheard exposes us all to cumulative trauma, sometimes termed small t trauma. What happens, Trish, is that leads to parent anxiety. And that parent anxiety gets transmitted to kids. So now they're carrying this anxiety around. That's a prime. Now they're primed for anxiety, and now they're primed for trauma. And I'm going to be looking for it. Oh, that confirmed it. That confirmed it. Oh yeah, that is trauma. I'm just traumatized. And they go through the whole life with a sort of a victim complex. And as I said before, even if you're wounded, it doesn't give you the right to bleed all over everyone. And I think they're teaching kids. And I think there's some kids, I'm sorry, but I think there's some kids, and I've heard from teachers about this, who are exploiting it.
Oh yeah.
They're using it as a way to misbehave and then say, oh, but I'm traumatized. And then there's really no consequences for these kids. And yes, I'm in favor of counselors in schools. I'm in favor of getting kids help. But what I'm not in favor of is continually transmitting this concept that we are helpless, hapless victims floating in the ether and just being constantly exposed to trauma. And it's just tearing us apart completely. Mm. I grew up in a more rough and tumble time. And I'm actually a proponent of kids being more physical when they're younger. In other words, kids should be allowed to go out and do crazy stuff. Like, we had ramps that we built, and we jumped our bikes and our skateboards. We played on dangerous equipment. If you go back to the 40s and you look at playground equipment from then, oh my gosh, that's crazy. That's literally dangerous. Literally a kid could die. But let me give you a really good example. When my son was in elementary school, they had this spider web thing. It's like this web structure that goes up, and you climb it and you can go to the top. Well, one of the kids at his school decided to jump off of that from the top, though. Because, hey, that's what we do. I mean, I used to jump off of roofs when I was a kid. Crazy stuff. I did. I jumped off of roofs all the time. They jumped off of this thing and they landed incorrectly and broke their arm. So then the teachers got together and the principal and whoever else and said, there's no more climbing to the top. So now the kids could climb up 2 or 3 feet. Oh, it's so much fun. The whole point is to climb to the top. That's why the structure is there, because you're learning your limitations. That kid was learning his limitations and his boundaries. Shouldn't have jumped from there. It should have just been a natural consequence. you jump from the top, you risk breaking your arm. Guess what? That's on you. Now, part of that is because we live in such a litigious society, they were scared of getting sued, which is sad. And I don't know. Another case, same school, they were throwing the footballs around, just regular leather footballs. And one kid got hit in the head and I guess whined about it enough and whatever. But we're outlawing leather footballs. We only use Nerf. I hate to tell you, when I was like that age, I was playing tackle football and I was getting pummeled because I was like 80 pounds and guys were like 120, 130 pounds. I was getting crushed on a daily basis. I got hurt. I got hurt so bad that I like killed these 2 teeth from a forearm. That rough and tumble kind of thing, though, I know people don't believe this, but that physical sort of gamut that you go through prepares you for the emotional component later on. It toughens you up a little bit. You have to get toughened up physically a little bit, and you have to toughen yourself up emotionally, because you know what? Nobody can guarantee you a safe zone for your entire life. And in fact, there is no learning in a safe zone. I mean, and by safe zone, I mean like nothing, nobody says anything bad. Nobody says anything, nothing bad ever happens. There's nothing emotionally disturbing to you. You have to have those things happen to you so you can grow as a human being and you can learn. You have to know what's not good so you know what is good. And I'm not like advocating, I know people in jail. I'm not advocating that kids should be like emotionally pummeled all the time. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we should allow kids to experience things in a natural environment, right? Like you have trigger warnings on content in schools now. What? You mean something I don't agree with, and now it's emotionally wounding and traumatizing me? Then they've told kids it will traumatize you. That's just another example of how kids are getting primed for trauma. It's not good. We have a more anxious generation than we've ever had, and it's because of these dynamics, Trish, in my opinion. So here's another thing. Over half the individuals who experience trauma actually go on to positively adapt and grow in the wake of their adversity. It's a phenomenon known as post-traumatic growth. You learn from pain and displeasure too, as much as you do from pleasure and safety and comfort. It's a balance. Obviously you don't want kids experiencing only that, because that's not good, but keeping them away from it and keeping them overly protected from it, you're priming trauma in children, in my opinion. And I always get in trouble for saying these things. I'm also a person that pointed out long ago that those curriculums that we spoke about in the past, I won't name the name, but when I came out and said that these were horrible curriculums and they were hurting kids, everybody told me I was wrong. I was right. And I'm right about this too, because the evidence is right there in front of us. I don't know how much more we want to, and it's not about me being egotistical. It's just like, can we not acknowledge the reality in front of us? We have a generation that is traumatizing themselves with trauma, like with the concept of trauma. And that doesn't mean that we don't have kids that are not traumatized, but that doesn't mean that those kids can behave in any fashion that they want to and then pawn it off on trauma, which is what teachers are telling me is happening. Like, oh, they're behaving this way. And then they say, oh, it's trauma. It's trauma. And some of it's genuine and some of it's not. And even when it's genuine, again, that's not an excuse to behave in any fashion that you want. I just believe we're priming trauma in our kids. I don't know how you feel about that.
Oh, no, I totally agree. And I think that that's the case in especially urban districts. We're taught to basically assume every kid is traumatized, because of their socioeconomic status. So what that really translated to was we were very much discouraged to set strong boundaries and to say no and to have rules and consequences. All of those things were seen as too difficult or too oppressive for an already traumatized population. Whereas I think it's the exact opposite. I think, people that have been traumatized need to learn coping skills, strategies. They need to learn how to, yes, understand and tell their story and how to communicate effectively. But it's just the worst thing I think you could possibly do to a person that's been genuinely traumatized is encourage emotional reactivity and meltdowns and all the things that we're seeing happening on social media. I saw a video of, somebody from Gen Z that was essentially saying that she was traumatized by her boss because she said that she has a time impairment, as in she is incapable of showing up to work on time. So she kind of found herself crying and why, I asked my boss, why do they not understand that I, have a time impairment disorder and I can't be expected to go to work? And it's, it's so ridiculous, but I think on a smaller scale, very subtly, by refusing to set limits for young people and refusing to have consequences and refusing to have high standards for certain populations, we're essentially teaching them that they are permanently disabled for life. Whereas whenever you read biographies, a lot of times of great world leaders or even great Americans, you read their background, and a lot of them, you know, they were orphaned, they went through wars, they went through all kinds of terrible things, and they came out, like you said, stronger. They had post-traumatic growth, you know, and not to say that in other generations there weren't terrible, you know, outcomes for a lot of the trauma, but in the same way, I think we're seeing kids who have had much less difficult lives than a lot of people all around the world and all throughout history that are doing 50 times worse than any other people were. And so to me, that's like a red flag.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we're really kind of overprotecting our kids from themselves, which you can't do. You know, birth is traumatic. Like, so you know, we come into the world through a traumatic event, but you know, if we're nurtured, we overcome that, right? One like I guess an analogy or a metaphor would be a butterfly, right? And then they're in a cocoon. Now, there's a point when they start breaking out of it, and they have to do it on their own. Like, so if you go into that cocoon and you cut it to make it easier for them, you peel it back, cut a little hole in it, they don't develop their bodies in a way that will allow them to live beyond that moment. So they'll die. They probably won't even break out of it. And if they do break out, if you get them out, they'll die almost immediately, because the process of going through and breaking through that cocoon is what builds the stamina and the physiology to be able to go on and do whatever they do, go pollinate. So it's just kind of the same thing with kids. You can't make it so easy for them and take away boundaries and consequences, and they need those things, right? And they need to be able to stand up on their own and have a sense of independence that is also grounded in the fact that not everything goes their way, right? Not everything goes your way. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And it's really about how you deal with the adversity that makes you a whole person. Anybody can go through easy stuff, but what defines you is how you deal with the nasty struggles, right, of life. And they're going to happen. And some people get more than others. And I don't know why, but it just happens that way. And we all go through it. But you making it easier for kids and making them think that their whole world is about that, it's all about trauma, I don't think you're helping kids. I think you're hurting them in the long run. So, and here's just something that I came up with. Look, I don't have any research based on this. All the other stuff I do. I left it. I gave you all the links. But I want to point this out. In the United States, we've had children of Holocaust go to schools here. And I've known some of them. Now, these are kids that were in camps, in concentration camps in either Germany or in Poland or wherever in Eastern Europe, and were there for a period of a year or two or longer, however they were. And then they came to the United States later and went to school. I would argue that's pretty traumatic. I don't think you could think of a situation that's more traumatic than that, okay? Except all these are pretty equal. But that's pretty bad, right? Did you see those kids acting as a trauma-informed child?
Yeah, those kids were not flipping desk and cussing out their teachers and screaming.
Nope. They didn't do any of that stuff. You know, it was pretty rare. You definitely didn't hear about it. Okay, well, what about kids that grew up in the segregated Jim Crow South? That's got to be a trauma, right? I mean, it's an oppressive system. I don't think you heard about those kids doing those kinds of things. Right. And I don't think you could get a more desperate situation than that. That's a horrible situation to be in, to feel alienated and oppressed like that. But they went on and they learned, and they didn't throw chairs at their teachers and do things like that. Children of the Great Depression, who literally saw family members die of starvation. Like, there were kids that just went without food constantly, and their parents died because of illness. They couldn't afford to go to a doctor or whatever. It was a grim, and it went on for like years and years and years, right? Is there like wide publicity about these kids acting out? I'm sure some of them did, but in general, they did not. They knew that they had to behave. How about children of fathers who died in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and so forth? Did you hear about these kids just like having tantrums and meltdowns? You've heard about like these clearings that they're having in schools now, right? They call them clearings.
No, I haven't heard of that.
A clearing or clear out is basically, I believe
Oh, a room clear. Sorry, I do know what you mean.
Yeah, okay, room clear. So yeah, the whole thing has to shut down because some kid's out of control, and the kid often gets out in the hallway and attacks other students or attacks the teachers or throws objects, and they have to clear all the students out, and they have to bring another adult in, like a counselor if they're even available, which we don't have enough in our schools. Or an assistant principal or a principal or some type of person outside of a teacher to manage the whole thing. And there are teachers who are having room clears for like an ongoing basis. In other words, once or twice a week. And there's some that never have it. But if you're having it even once a month, it's way too much. And the irony of those room clears, those are traumatizing to all the other kids. Literally traumatizing. And then you got to go back and try to teach in that context, and your brain is not primed because it's in the fight or flight mode, right? And now learning is almost impossible. And even when that's not occurring, kids are always thinking, when is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? And I'm stressed because I can't even focus on it. My point is, fatherlessness is a trauma. You want to talk about trauma? Let's talk about the fact that we don't have enough fathers in homes. That is an ongoing wound that's bleeding out constantly in our culture. So if we're going to talk about trauma-informed decision-making, and I always do that because all the neologisms in education just kind of get overwhelming sometimes. But if we want to talk about trauma-informed decision-making, why aren't we talking about that, Trish? Why aren't we talking about fatherlessness? Again, I want to reiterate this. I am not saying that kids are not traumatized, and I'm also not saying they shouldn't get help. They should. But we need to be careful about how we're communicating and talking about trauma in such a way that we're not just priming kids for more trauma. And B, if trauma is a big thing, and it is, why aren't we talking about fatherlessness as a source of trauma? Ongoing trauma. Not a one-time event, but ongoing.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so I want to kind of leave you with these final words from this author. She's a very well-written author, Charlena E. Jackson. In the book, Dear Fathers of the Fatherless Children, she wrote, "Fathers of the fatherless children, open your eyes and know your presence is very critical. Be your son's hero and let him know he can conquer the world. Be your daughter's first knight in shining armor. Be a part of your son's and daughter's success instead of their pain." And that's the appeal that I want to make. And the other appeal is for women to help men do that. We need each other. We're not going to just do it on our own. We need to all work together, because our children depend on it. And these children are literally, it's cliche, they literally are our future, right? And we all want a good, positive future. So why aren't we coming together to address this issue? Because this issue is not going away. It's not going away. And I think we should stop. We've destigmatized so many other things. Why can't we destigmatize conversation around fatherlessness? I don't understand. Somebody help me understand it. I hope maybe one of your viewers can help me understand why we can't do that. Because until we do, we're going to continue to have all of this data that I cited, that you cited, not going away. And these kids are ending up, you talk about the school to prison pipeline. How about the fatherlessness to prison pipeline? That is really evident. And I've seen it directly with the students that I've worked with in prisons. So, well, they're juvenile detention centers, but they're prisons, and you're in prison, basically. You're in a form of jail. So I don't know, I just want to have an ongoing conversation. And again, I don't have all of the answers, but I think it begins with putting down our defensive shields and our ideologies and having an honest and open conversation about what we can do to start addressing and attenuating some of these things. And, that's my appeal to you and to your viewers.
This was an excellent conversation. I did have a lot of people bring up the idea of divorced dads. And I was curious if you just had any kind of advice or ideas for dads that might not be in a relationship anymore with the mother of their children. Any ideas on what they could do?
Yeah. So first of all, if you're going through a divorce, be prepared to fight for your child, for your right to access to your child, because sometimes you have to. A couple of my friends that went through divorce really got put through the grinder. But they did it. They did what they had to do to stay in contact with their children. And then the second thing is being there. It's not just about quality time. And the quantity is important too. How much time are you actually spending with your children? The other thing is what we talked about earlier, and it was one of the bullets, is what's your relationship with the mother? Even if it's not good, you know what? Fake it. I don't care. That drama is not the problem of that child. They don't need to hear it. They don't need to see it. They don't need to. And Trish, I'm a parent. We're all guilty of it. I get it. I'm not some innocent guy. Like, I know that sometimes when my wife and I have gotten into arguments, our son has gotten dragged into it. It wasn't intentional. It just happens. And I felt really bad about it. And she did too. But I mean, sometimes it happens. Sometimes it happens. But you got to be really conscious about not having that negativity. Don't say bad things about the other parent. It hurts that child because that child loves that parent. And now they got to internalize all that negativity. Don't do that. Don't try to have, at least on the surface, an amenable relationship with your significant other, wife, whatever. Visit your child often. Do things that help them learn about life. Do fun things, of course, but teach them things. Talk to them about things. I don't know, you don't know what conversation's going on the other side. So don't be afraid to have those conversations with your kid. All those things, I think, can sort of attenuate the damage that divorce does. Don't be weighed down by guilt either. You had to do whatever you had to do. I mean, I'm not going to question anybody. Maybe that was maybe you two being together was worse for the kid. I don't know. It's hard to know. Every situation is different. But I mean, I think if you stay involved in your kid's life, try to have a good relationship with the other parent, with the mother, try to have as many positive experiences and an open communication with your kid. And don't be afraid to set boundaries. Because I know one of the things that happens is, sometimes the boundaries are different in one place and another. And so ideally what you'd have it to do is get together with that other parent and say, can we establish some common ground rules? Absent that, if you have certain ground rules, I think the thing that I think you have to ask yourself is like, what is most crucial to you? Like, what's really important that your kid know and understand and be able to do? Okay, drive a pole into the ground, stake into the ground, hold it and hold on for dear life, and don't give ground on whatever you think is really important. Be open to negotiation for some of the other things. Because if you're going to fight your kid about every single thing, and mom does it this way, and you know what I mean? Like, maybe you just need to give a little bit on that. But on the things that you find important, don't budge on that. And I guess the final thing is, as kids get older, the way you relate to them kind of changes. As kids become high schoolers, you don't relate to them in a different way than you relate to. They're not this child that you had when they were in elementary school. They have their own thoughts about the world, and they're becoming an adult. So what are you doing to nurture that? And by the way, I say all these things. I probably failed on all these things on some level, in some place at some time. I'm by far from a perfect parent. Like when I look back, I'm like, oh God, I did this. There are lots of things I wish I had done differently. But I will say that I was like a constant in my child's life, and I tried to always teach him right from wrong and give him guidance. And we butt heads sometimes because he's Gen Z and I'm Gen X. We're very different generations, but I try to keep an open mind, and I think that's important too. And don't give up, don't be discouraged, because I don't think the system encourages fathers. So you have to maybe find some other fathers that are going through that and connect with them. But don't be discouraged, I think is my whole thing. Like, don't be discouraged from being involved in your child's life. Continue down that path. It'll be so worth it. Not just for you, but for that kid. They'll be a better human being because of you. With all of your flaws, they'll be a better human being because of you. I don't know. That's just how I feel.
Oh, good. I love it. Well, I'm hoping that anybody that's watched this video this long can tell me in the comment section, what do you think are the ingredients of a good father? And if you're brave enough, I want you guys to tell us the stories of your dads. What were your dads like? If you are a dad, how is it? We want to have a fruitful conversation in the comment section. And if any of you guys didn't see the last video we did, I would encourage everybody to watch it. I'll put it in the box so you guys can watch it. But thank you again, Gary. This has been an awesome conversation. And if you ever want to come back, you are welcome to. For my audience, if you want to interview with me, you can email me at teachertherapytrish and let me know if there are any topics that you have for the future. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye, everybody.
Bye.